Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. David never imagined his quiet investment would turn into a battleground, but when a tax notice revealed a garage, one he never built, on his land, he knew something was deeply wrong. Confronting his neighbor, he met Karen Wilson, a woman who didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them. This wasn't a mistake, it was theft. David Holmes had never expected to find himself in a legal battle over his own land. As an engineer and a seasoned real estate investor, he had always been meticulous about his property holdings. 5 years ago, he had purchased a 0.8-acre vacant lot in a quiet but upscale suburban neighborhood just outside of Austin, Texas. The land, nestled between two well-maintained houses, was a long-term investment, one that he planned to develop when the time was right. The neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association, HOA, a powerful entity that enforced strict regulations on its members. However, David's property was never part of the HOA, as it had been bought independently, predating the formation of the association. That fact would soon become the core of a vicious dispute. For years, David had been busy with his engineering projects, traveling often, and only checking in on the land periodically. He had paid his property taxes on time, ensured that the county's records were up to date, and had never given the land much thought beyond its future potential. That changed one morning when he received an alarming notice in the mail. The envelope bore the letterhead of Travis County Tax Office, and inside was a revised property tax assessment. The document stated that a new structure had been built on his land, significantly increasing the taxable value. Confused, David skimmed through the pages until he saw something that made his stomach drop. A detached garage, measuring approximately 600 square feet, had been officially recorded on his property. David immediately grabbed his keys and drove to the neighborhood. As he pulled up to his land, his confusion turned to sheer disbelief. Where there had once been an open lot, now stood a large, fully constructed metal garage, complete with a driveway extension leading to the adjacent house. The garage looked brand new, freshly painted in a neutral gray, and there were 2 cars parked inside, cars that did not belong to him. He stepped out of his truck, eyes scanning the property. Someone had built a structure on his land without his knowledge or permission. Before he could fully process the absurdity of the situation, a woman appeared from the neighboring house. She was in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of entitlement that seemed almost palpable. David recognized her immediately. Her name was Karen Wilson, the self-appointed president of the local HOA. She had a notorious reputation for micromanaging the community, known for issuing petty violation notices over minor infractions like mailbox colors or trash can placements. She approached with an expression of thinly veiled smugness. "Oh, David, it's so nice to finally see you here," she said with a forced sweetness. David folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Karen, would you care to explain why there's a garage on my property?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Well, the land was sitting unused for so long, and the community needed more functional space. You weren't doing anything with it, and the HOA agreed it would be best utilized this way." David blinked in absolute disbelief. "The HOA? My land is not part of the HOA. That garage is illegal." Karen waved a dismissive hand as if this were a trivial matter. "Oh, let's not get technical. We've already landscaped around it, put in the driveway, and made it match the community aesthetic. It was for the greater good. And honestly, it just made more sense for me to take responsibility for the space." David took a step closer, his patience hanging by a thread. "Let me get this straight. You decided, without asking me, to build a garage on my property, and then connected it to your house. And now you're acting like you did me a favor?" Karen shrugged. "It's not like you were using it. Besides, it's practically part of my lot now." David's hands clenched into fists. He had heard of HOA overreach before, but this was on another level entirely. "You need to remove it, immediately." Karen's polite facade cracked, and a more hostile edge crept into her voice. "David, I really don't think you want to go down that road. The HOA has already spent money on improvements, and it would be a shame if you had to deal with legal fees and community backlash. Maybe we can come to a reasonable agreement." David stared at her, realizing exactly what she was doing. She was trying to intimidate him. She had assumed that because he had left the lot undeveloped, he would simply roll over and let her steal it. She had no idea who she was dealing with. David took out his phone and snapped several pictures of the garage, the altered driveway, and the way it encroached onto his lot. "This isn't an agreement. This is theft," he said coldly. "And I promise you, Karen, you're not getting away with it." Karen crossed her arms, her expression darkening. "Well then, I suppose we'll have to settle this the hard way." David didn't respond. He had seen enough. Without another word, he turned, got back into his truck, and drove off. As he pulled onto the highway, his mind was already racing through the next steps. He would need to consult an attorney, obtain the original property records, and file a formal complaint. Karen thought she could bully him into giving up his own land, but she had underestimated just how far he was willing to go to protect what was rightfully his. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was war. David wasted no time. As soon as he got home, he compiled every document he had regarding the purchase of his land: the deed, survey maps, property tax receipts, and a copy of the HOA exclusion clause. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. Karen had blatantly stolen his property and was now acting as if she had some kind of authority over it. He needed to shut this down before she could dig in her heels any further. The first call he made was to a real estate attorney, Mark Caldwell, a seasoned lawyer specializing in property disputes and HOA conflicts. Within minutes of explaining the situation, Mark was already shaking his head in disbelief. "This is outright fraud," Mark said firmly. "She had no legal right to alter your property, let alone construct a building on it. But before we take legal action, we need proof that she knew what she was doing was illegal. That's going to be key in court." David had already anticipated this. "I recorded part of our conversation earlier today," he said, sending Mark the audio clip. "She admitted that she knew the land was mine." Mark listened, and when it ended, he let out a dry chuckle. "That's gold. She just incriminated herself. This means we can build a strong case. But be prepared. People like this don't back down easily. If she's the HOA president, she's probably got the board in her pocket." The HOA strikes back. The next morning, David received a certified letter from the HOA. As he tore it open, he felt his blood boil. It was an official violation notice, claiming that his unkept lot was bringing down community property values. It demanded that he either remedy the situation by formally deeding the land to the HOA or face legal action. The letter falsely claimed that the land had always been under HOA jurisdiction. Furious, David took the letter straight to Mark's office. The attorney skimmed the document and let out a low whistle. "They're doubling down," Mark said. "They're trying to create a paper trail, making it seem like you've always been in violation. Classic HOA power play. But they're bluffing." David narrowed his eyes. "How do we shut them down?" "First, we send them a formal cease and desist letter, making it clear that you are not under their jurisdiction. Then, we file a property dispute claim with the county recorder's office. If they try to fight it in court, they'll need actual legal documentation proving that your land was ever under HOA control, which of course they don't have." David nodded. "Let's do it." The neighborhood turns against him. Just as David was gearing up for the legal battle, Karen escalated her attacks in a different way. She began turning the neighbors against him. He started noticing cold stares and whispered conversations whenever he drove through the community. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, while others glared openly. The worst came when a group of HOA members knocked on his truck window as he parked near his property. "You're being selfish, David," one man, an older resident named Frank Hensley, said. "Karen explained the situation to us. That lot was abandoned, and she put it to good use. Why are you making this into a legal fight?" David stared at him in disbelief. "She built a garage on my land. That's called trespassing, Frank." "Look, we're a tight-knit community," another woman chimed in. "We don't need outsiders coming in and ruining things. The HOA has worked hard to maintain this neighborhood's high standards." David clenched his jaw. So that was the play. Karen was framing him as the villain, making it seem like he was the unreasonable one. He needed to fight back, but he had to do it strategically. Karen's final warning. Later that night, David returned to his property, flashlight in hand, taking more pictures of the garage and the illegally extended driveway. He wanted to be fully prepared for when the lawsuit officially started. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed something off. His no trespassing signs had been ripped down. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out, "You really don't want to do this, David." He turned to see Karen standing by the edge of the property, her arms crossed. Her voice was low and full of warning. "I already told you," she continued, stepping closer. "You're fighting a battle you won't win. The community is against you. The HOA has resources. Do you really want to waste thousands of dollars on a lawsuit when you could just sign over the land and walk away?" David's grip on his phone tightened. "You think intimidation is going to work?" he asked. Karen smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "It's not intimidation, David. It's just reality. You should think carefully about your next move." She turned on her heel and walked back toward her house, leaving David standing in the dark. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. Karen had just declared war. David wasn't intimidated. If Karen thought she could scare him into backing down, she had grossly miscalculated. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about principle. She had tried to bully him, manipulate the system, and steal what was legally his. Now he was going to make sure she faced consequences. The next morning, David met with his attorney, Mark Caldwell, in his downtown office. Mark had already started gathering the necessary legal ammunition. He spread out a stack of documents on his desk and tapped the topmost one. "This," Mark said, "is a formal cease and desist letter. We're sending this to both Karen and the HOA, making it crystal clear that they have no legal claim to your land and demanding that the garage be removed immediately. If they ignore it, we move forward with a lawsuit." David nodded. "And what about the property records? I need something ironclad to prove they tampered with them." Mark smiled knowingly and slid another folder toward him. "I requested the original plat maps and property tax records from the county. It confirms two things. 1, your land was never part of the HOA. 2, Karen submitted an unauthorized request to adjust the parcel boundaries." David's eyes narrowed. "So she forged documents to make it look like my land was part of her property?" "Exactly," Mark confirmed. "And that's where things get interesting. If we can prove intent, this isn't just a civil dispute. It could become criminal fraud." Armed with this knowledge, David decided to gather additional evidence. He started by installing trail cameras around the perimeter of his land. If Karen or her HOA lackeys tried anything, he would have them on video. He also hired a private land surveyor who confirmed that Karen's garage extended nearly 20 feet onto David's lot. Meanwhile, he started talking to neighbors, hoping to find anyone who had witnessed the construction of the garage. Most people were hesitant. Karen still had influence, and nobody wanted to get involved in a legal battle. But then he knocked on the door of Henry Lawson, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. Henry let out a deep sigh and motioned for David to step inside. "I knew what she was doing was wrong," Henry admitted. "I watched them pour the foundation for that garage late at night, weeks before she even filed the paperwork. I told my wife, this isn't right, but what were we supposed to do? She runs the HOA like a dictatorship. If we speak out, we get harassed." David's stomach turned. "Henry, would you be willing to give a sworn statement?" The old man hesitated, then nodded. "It's time someone stood up to her. If you take this to court, I'll tell them everything." That night, David returned home feeling like he was finally making progress. But just as he was about to go to bed, his phone buzzed with an email from Mark. Subject: Urgent. Karen filed a lawsuit against you. David's eyes widened as he read the message. Karen had gone on the offensive. She had filed a legal claim for adverse possession. Adverse possession was a little-known property law loophole that allowed someone to claim land if they had used it openly and continuously for a certain period of time. Karen was arguing that since she had improved the lot and maintained it, she now had a legal right to own it permanently. David's blood boiled. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. This was theft in broad daylight. Mark had included a short note at the bottom. "Don't panic. We can crush this in court, but be prepared. This fight is about to get ugly." David clenched his jaw. "Let's do this." David sat in the Travis County Courthouse, his hands clenched as he watched Karen Wilson saunter in, dressed as if she were attending a brunch rather than a legal battle over stolen land. She wore an air of unshakable confidence, greeting the HOA board members who had come to support her with a smug smile. To her, this was a mere formality, a battle she had already won in her mind. His attorney, Mark Caldwell, leaned in and whispered, "She's overconfident. That'll work against her." David hoped so, because the stakes were high. Karen had officially filed for adverse possession, claiming that since she had built on and maintained the land, it should now legally be hers. If the judge agreed, she could steal his land right out from under him. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Lisa Moreno, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat. She glanced at the case files, already frowning at the complexity of the situation. "Let's begin," she said. Karen's attorney, a smooth-talking man named Richard Whitmore, stood first. He paced the courtroom with practiced ease, addressing the judge as if this were a simple misunderstanding rather than outright fraud. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Mrs. Wilson, has taken care of this land for years. She's invested in it, improved it, and ensured that it remained part of the aesthetic harmony of the community. She added a garage, landscaping, and a driveway extension, all while the so-called owner," he shot a glance at David, "abandoned the lot, allowing it to become an eyesore." David gritted his teeth. He wanted to shout that this was a blatant lie, but Mark rested a hand on his arm, signaling him to stay calm. Whitmore continued, "Under Texas law, adverse possession applies when a party openly and continuously maintains a piece of land, especially if the original owner has shown no interest in using it. My client, Mrs. Wilson, has done exactly that. She has upheld the integrity of the neighborhood when Mr. Holmes could not be bothered to. Therefore, we respectfully request the court grant her full ownership of the land." Karen sat back with an arrogant smirk, as if the case was already decided. Mark stood up, adjusting his tie, and walked to the center of the courtroom with measured confidence. He wasn't rushed, wasn't flustered, just calm and deadly precise. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the opposing counsel is painting a very convenient picture, one that conveniently leaves out all of the fraud and deception involved." Karen's smile faltered. Mark held up a thick folder. "Let's look at the actual facts." He placed the original property records on the judge's bench. "First, the deed and plat map clearly prove that my client, Mr. Holmes, has continuously owned this land. Second, we have evidence that Mrs. Wilson fraudulently altered county records to make it appear as if the land was part of her property. That alone is a serious legal offense." The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping through the files. Karen shifted in her seat. "But let's talk about abandonment," Mark continued. "Mrs. Wilson claims my client neglected the land. However, we have copies of his tax payments every year proving that he has always maintained legal ownership. Additionally, we have a sworn statement from a neighbor, Mr. Henry Lawson, who witnessed Mrs. Wilson building the garage at night, weeks before she ever filed any paperwork." Karen's face drained of color. "Oh, and one more thing," Mark added. "My client recorded his conversation with Mrs. Wilson, where she admitted that she knew the land belonged to him but justified taking it anyway." David watched as the judge pressed play on the audio recording. Karen's voice filled the silent courtroom. "Well, the land was sitting unused for so long, and the HOA agreed it would be best utilized this way. It just made more sense for me to take responsibility for the space." The judge sighed audibly. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, fixing Karen with an unimpressed stare, "it sounds to me like you knew perfectly well that the land wasn't yours." Karen's attorney quickly stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client—" "Enough," Judge Moreno cut in, already having made up her mind. She turned to Karen. "You not only knowingly built on someone else's property, but you attempted to manipulate the system to steal it outright. This is not a case of adverse possession. This is trespassing and fraud." Karen looked stunned, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. Judge Moreno banged her gavel. "I am issuing an immediate injunction against Mrs. Wilson and the HOA. No further modifications can be made to the property, and the garage must remain untouched until further legal action determines its fate." David felt a rush of relief, but the judge wasn't done. "As for ownership," she continued, "this case is not over yet. While it is clear that the property belongs to Mr. Holmes, there is still the issue of the illegally constructed garage. That matter will require a separate hearing." David's stomach tightened. He had won the first battle, but the fight wasn't over yet. Karen stood up abruptly, her face burning with rage. She turned toward David and hissed under her breath as she passed him. "This isn't over," she spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." David watched her storm out of the courtroom, then turned back to Mark, who grinned knowingly. "She's scared," Mark said, "which means we're winning." David exhaled slowly. One battle down. The war for his land was just getting started. David barely had time to process the courtroom victory before a new problem arose, one that threatened to undo everything he had fought for. 2 days after the hearing, he received an urgent phone call from his private land surveyor. "David," the man said, his voice tense, "you need to get down to your property. Now." David's stomach dropped. "What's going on?" "There's a construction crew tearing into your land. I think Karen is trying to demolish the garage before the court can rule on it." David sped through traffic, his heart pounding. As he pulled up to the property, his worst fears were confirmed. A team of workers with heavy-duty equipment was already there. A bulldozer sat near the garage, and several men were dismantling the walls, loading materials onto a flatbed truck. Karen stood nearby, overseeing everything with a phone in her hand. When she saw David storming toward her, she didn't even flinch. "Karen!" David shouted. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned to him, her expression cool and composed. "Oh, David, you lost, remember? The garage is coming down. It's a liability, and the HOA is taking responsibility for clearing the land." David couldn't believe the audacity. The judge issued an injunction. "You're legally barred from altering the property until the next hearing." Karen gave a mocking laugh. "Well, that ruling was about ownership, but since the garage is technically an unapproved structure, we're just enforcing community compliance standards." She smiled sweetly. "Don't worry, you'll thank me later." David pulled out his phone and immediately called the police. Before the officers arrived, a voice called out from the sidewalk. "You're digging your own grave, Karen." David turned to see Henry Lawson, the elderly neighbor who had spoken up during the case. He was standing with a stack of papers in his hand, his expression steely. "What's this?" David asked. Henry stepped forward, holding up the documents. "Proof that Karen and the HOA have done this before. I've been keeping records on their shady dealings for years. She's used HOA funds illegally, pressured homeowners into signing away property rights, and even lied about zoning permits." Karen's face went pale. "Henry, you don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Henry shot back, "and I'm ready to testify in court." At that moment, the police arrived, and David smiled for the first time all day. Karen had just dug herself into a deeper hole. The final courtroom showdown was far more intense than the first. By now, the case had drawn attention, not just from the neighbors, but from local news outlets, which had caught wind of a power-hungry HOA president attempting to steal land through fraud. The courtroom was packed, with several homeowners from Karen's neighborhood watching the proceedings unfold. Some were supporters, but many had begun to question her leadership, especially after Henry Lawson came forward with evidence of her history of corruption. David sat next to his attorney, Mark Caldwell, as the judge, Lisa Marino, took her seat. This time, there was a different energy in the air. Karen no longer exuded the same smug confidence. Her usual air of superiority was replaced by frustration and barely concealed panic. She knew the walls were closing in. Judge Moreno glanced over the case file and sighed audibly. "Mrs. Wilson, after our last hearing, I issued a clear injunction preventing any modifications to the disputed property. Yet days later, you attempted to have the garage demolished. Do you care to explain why you directly defied a court order?" Karen's attorney, Richard Whitmore, quickly stood up, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, the demolition was a matter of community compliance. The HOA had an obligation to remove an unapproved structure." Mark scoffed and stood. "The only obligation they had was to obey the law. That garage was at the center of an ongoing property dispute, and Mrs. Wilson's attempt to destroy it was nothing more than evidence tampering." Judge Moreno turned her gaze to Karen, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, her voice edged with impatience, "do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" Karen hesitated, then crossed her arms, doubling down. "I was just doing what was best for the community." The judge's expression hardened. "We'll come back to that." Mark walked to the center of the courtroom, gathering the evidence that would end Karen's reign of manipulation once and for all. "Your Honor, we have several key pieces of evidence that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mrs. Wilson knowingly and fraudulently altered county records to claim land that never belonged to her." He pulled up a large printed document, placing it on an easel for the court to see. This is the original Travis County property plat map, which clearly shows that Lot 76, owned by Mr. Holmes, was never included in the HOA's jurisdiction. He then placed another document beside it. And this is the falsified plat that Mrs. Wilson submitted in an attempt to rezone the property under HOA control. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mark turned to the judge. We also have a sworn affidavit from a county clerk stating that Mrs. Wilson personally submitted these fraudulent documents without authorization. Karen's face turned ghostly pale. The final blow came when Henry Lawson was called to the stand. The elderly man spoke with confidence, detailing how he had watched Karen's crew construct the garage under the cover of night, long before any official paperwork was ever filed. Judge Moreno took a long, measured pause before speaking. Mrs. Wilson, not only have you engaged in an unauthorized property grab, but you've committed fraud, violated a court order, and attempted to intimidate property owners into submission. This is beyond an HOA dispute. This is a criminal offense. Karen's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, with all due respect, my client, enough. The judge's voice cut through the air like a knife. She turned her full attention to Karen, who sat motionless, her mouth slightly open in shock. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Holmes, Judge Moreno declared. The land legally belongs to him. Mrs. Wilson's claim of adverse possession is denied. The illegally constructed garage is to be removed at her expense within 30 days. David exhaled deeply, relief washing over him, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into Mrs. Wilson's conduct as HOA president, including her misuse of HOA funds and potential criminal charges for fraudulent filings. Additionally, given her direct violation of a court injunction, I am holding her in contempt of court. She will be fined $10,000 and placed on probation for 12 months. Karen shot out of her seat. This is absurd. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. The judge gave her a cold stare. Mrs. Wilson, I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse for yourself. David watched as Karen slowly sat back down, her hands clenching the arms of her chair. The once untouchable queen of the HOA had just been dethroned. As the judge banged the gavel, Mark leaned over to David and whispered, "We won." David nodded, finally allowing himself to smile. Karen had thought she could steal his land and manipulate the system, but today justice had prevailed. The courtroom ruling sent shockwaves through the community. News of Karen's fraud, manipulation, and legal defeat spread like wildfire. By the time David stepped out of the courthouse, he could already feel the shift in the air. The power Karen once held was crumbling. She had spent years controlling the HOA with an iron grip, intimidating homeowners into silence, enforcing rules that benefited her, and using the HOA's funds as if they were her personal bank account. Now, with the judge's ruling and the criminal investigation looming over her, her once loyal followers were quickly turning against her. David didn't have to wait long to see her empire collapse. 3 days after the verdict, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. While Karen had always run the meetings like a dictator, this time, the energy in the room was different. Residents were furious, not just because she had tried to steal land, but because they had unknowingly funded her legal battle. When the treasurer, Linda Parsons, revealed that Karen had misused thousands of dollars of HOA money for legal fees and falsified documents, the board immediately voted to remove her as president. The decision was unanimous. Karen stormed out of the meeting, red-faced and seething, but there was nothing she could do. She had lost everything. Within a week, Karen became the neighborhood pariah. Neighbors who once followed her avoided eye contact in public. Anonymous flyers were posted around the community listing her fraudulent activities. Parents refused to let their kids near her house, whispering about how she had been investigated for criminal activity. The final humiliation came when her own real estate agent refused to work with her, telling her that no one wanted to buy from a disgraced HOA president. Desperate and drowning in legal fees, Karen had no choice. She put her house up for sale and prepared to leave the neighborhood she once ruled. Meanwhile, David wasted no time in reclaiming what was rightfully his. The illegal garage was torn down piece by piece, with Karen forced to cover every cent of the demolition costs. He installed security cameras and a reinforced fence, ensuring no one would ever try to steal his land again. The neighborhood, once hostile toward him, began to change its tune, especially after it became clear how corrupt Karen had been. One afternoon, as he stood by his land, watching the last remnants of the garage being hauled away, an elderly voice spoke behind him. "You did the right thing, son." David turned to see Henry Lawson, the neighbor whose testimony had helped bring Karen down. "She thought she could bully everyone forever," Henry said, shaking his head. "Took a man like you to finally stop her." David smiled. He hadn't just won back his land. He had helped end the reign of a neighborhood tyrant. And Karen. She had been reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. With Karen gone, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. The oppressive atmosphere she had cultivated for years vanished, and in its place was something almost unfamiliar, a sense of freedom. The HOA, now under new leadership, scrambled to repair its reputation. They eliminated Karen's unnecessary rules, issued refunds to homeowners who had been unfairly fined, and even voted to make HOA membership optional, a move that never would have been possible under Karen's rule. David, though never part of the HOA, was now seen as a hero by many in the community. The same people who had once greeted him with hostility now nodded respectfully when he passed. Some even apologized, admitting that they had been blindly following Karen's lies. One evening, David stood on his reclaimed land, watching the sunset. The lot, once a battleground, was now his once again, without question. The fence he had installed stood firm, a symbol of resilience, not just in property ownership, but in standing up against those who abuse power. He thought about everything that had happened, about how close he had come to losing something that was rightfully his. Karen had underestimated him, thinking he would roll over like so many others before him. But she had been wrong. This fight had taught him a valuable lesson. Never assume someone else won't try to take what's yours. Bullies thrive on fear, but they crumble when confronted. The law is a powerful weapon, if you know how to use it. As he turned to leave, he noticed a for sale sign still stuck in Karen's front yard. He chuckled to himself. The queen of the HOA was gone, and she was never coming back.